to AEDT 4120, Serious Gaming and Simulations. Week 2, Analog Meets Digital, Video Clip 2 of 4. I'm Professor Bill Kapralos, and over the next few minutes I'm going to talk to you about simulation in education. However, prior to doing so, here's the list of analysis questions for this particular video clip. Number 1, what is an educational simulation and what is a simulation game? Number 2, what are the 5 critical characteristics of simulation games? Number 3, what are the issues with the edutainment era? And finally, number 4, what is the difference between the simulation games of the edutainment era and those of today? Educational simulation. Let's begin by defining what an educational simulation actually is. So a simple definition of educational simulation is as follows. An educational simulation is a simulation that has been developed for educational purposes. In other words, it's a simulation that has been developed to allow for the transfer of skill and knowledge to its users. It's also probably very safe to assume that you've all participated in some form of educational simulation. Role-playing, which is one of humanity's oldest social activities, is in fact a form of educational simulation. Role-playing itself can be defined as the changing of one's behavior to fulfill a social role, according to the Oxford Dictionary. Role-playing itself dates back many thousands of years, and it was probably first performed around the campfire and later in some form of theater. Essentially, it was used for entertainment purposes and to allow for communications well before we became literate. Role-playing has also been used as a form of training in military circles for centuries, and in fact it continues to be a very popular form of training amongst various militaries. And more recently, role-playing has been used as a form of therapy. However, despite the fact that role-playing was facilitating learning for a long time, even though we weren't necessarily aware of it, it was not seen as a deliberate teaching technique until about the 1950s. At this point, role-playing became extremely popular and it was introduced and incorporated into many curricula. And as I pointed out earlier, in formal education, role-playing is known as a form of educational simulation. We now know what an educational simulation is. Previously, we examined games, and we also examined games used for training and education, albeit briefly. Or in other words, we looked at educational games. So given this knowledge, do you think an educational simulation is a game? Or is it simply a simulation? So there are those in various educational domains that see no distinction between educational games and simulations. For example, Thiagarajan, who is a training specialist specializing in in-class and paper-based learning activities, he considers all training that he designs as simulation games. And within that context, he identified 5 critical characteristics of training simulation games. So according to Thiagarajan, the 5 critical characteristics of what he terms simulation games are as follows. Conflict, which can also be described as challenge. Rules, which essentially are constraints on the player's behaviors. Closure, the game must come to an end. It cannot last forever. Contrivance, all games are contrived situations, or in other words, they have to be created for a particular purpose. And finally, correspondence. The simulation game has to be designed to respond to some selected aspects of reality. So these are important for both digital and non-digital games and most simulations that are considered games. Again, it goes back into that question. Is a simulation a game? Well, according to Thiagarajan, he defines this notion of simulation game and lists these 5 characteristics. For simulations being used for learning and development, challenge and closure are often imposed from outside the simulation itself. Furthermore, we may not necessarily have a clear ending and a goal within the simulation. So when used for educational purposes, the goals and endpoint definitions are typically provided to the users of the simulation as part of some pre-simulation briefing period. Now, when we look at the 5 characteristics described by Thiagarajan, there's really not much difference between simulation games and whether they are digital or non-digital. However, looking at this digital versus non-digital question in a little more depth, when we examine the details of the simulations themselves, so in other words, the level of correspondence, the degree of complexity, or the way constraints are enforced, there actually is a striking difference between analog and digital. And these differences in structure require fundamental differences in design and development of the simulation itself. So let's just briefly look at the history of educational simulations, which will provide some context into the simulations and game-based learning and training techniques that we use currently. In the early 1970s, the future of simulations in gaming and education seemed very bright. There was a big hype about the use of games and simulations in training circles. There was a study that was conducted, and it concluded that simulation and gaming were the fastest growing new methods of interaction. Games, gaming, and simulation were used interchangeably in educational settings, and there was this huge optimism about their learning value, and this lasted into the mid-1980s. This was essentially the consensus. There seems every reason to believe that elements of simulation play can be transferred or adapted from their existing contexts and used consciously as an approach to learning. That pretty well summarizes how everyone felt about simulation and games in an educational setting. Live action or paper-based educational simulations and live paper or board games were all treated as part of the same educational approach. No difference. Various forms of analog simulations and games have been used in adult business training since the 1950s, when this buzz of educational simulation started to first appear. The games back then typically had more formalized procedures and more structured relationships, and the games were often turned into contests where teams would compete for some prize. In the 1970s, and even into the 1980s and 1990s, digital simulations were still rather crude. They were also cumbersome, and as a result, it was concluded that the purpose of machine simulation is usually to find answers rather than understand processes. And with data, chance factors programmed into a machine, human participation is limited to an initial development of the program and a response to a final result. This was concluded by Taylor and Walford in 1972. In other words, basically the human interaction or participation within a digital simulation was essentially writing the programs and responding to the final result that it provided. As a result, computer simulations were not seriously considered as an educational technology. Furthermore, you also have to remember that during this time, computing power was very limited and it was extremely expensive. Given this lack of computing power, there was still limitations to what you could do with simulations. This ushered in what's known as the edutainment era during roughly the early to mid-1980s. With the advent of the PC in the early 1980s, formal education first embraced the idea of using the PC as a personal learning technology. Many education experts saw computer-based simulations and games as extensions of the games they already knew and used. Computer-aided instruction became the technology of the day. It appeared as if there was nothing that computers could not do to enhance learning, and this included computer games. During this edutainment era, analog simulations and games were already widely accepted, and many education experts simply saw computer-based simulations and games as extensions of these analog simulations and games. Many influential educators at the time, including, for example, Seymour Papert from MIT, talked about how computers in the classroom would revolutionize and transform education. And of course, this was also the era when video games started to become very popular. So many educators, not-profit, and for-profit organizations began building educational computer games. The view was that one could wrap any instruction inside a game and thereby enhance the learning experience. Now, of course, we already know this does not work. At the time, many games were produced without bothering to learn anything about the computer, the learners, and the game itself. Most of these educational entertainments were actually quite awful. They lacked design. and they lacked instructional design, to be more specific. So the majority of the educational games of this particular era did not live up to the expectations, and in fact, it really turned people away from the use of educational-based games. And it really did paint a very bad image of them. The resulting backlash from that era still exists today. If we fast forward to the early 2000s and post-edutainment era, the optimism for learning via games was replaced by claims that games were almost always less efficient than other educational methodologies. Furthermore, it was seen that players in games were primarily motivated by winning. And this motivation for winning actually interferes with educational goals. It started becoming clear that games designed by educators for learning could not live up to the earlier expectations. And furthermore, simulations in games were separated as a result. Simulations were legitimate educational tools, while games were discouraged and ignored. Even though the early 2000s was only about a decade ago, the views presented then are actually already outdated. They certainly didn't take into account the current state of technology, the great computing power that we currently have available, the gaming phenomenon that we're in, and of course the internet and the possibilities that the internet presents. Those prior views were presented by those who had little or no formal training in computer science, simulations, or game development. Those that claimed games could not live up to earlier expectations had very little training in computer science and had very little knowledge of technology. Did not actually use or play computer video games, and assumed that computer and video games were just electronic versions of the in-class paper-based simulations and games that they were using all along, which is, in fact, very false. The last 10 years have given us unprecedented development in the field of computer games. With respect to simulation in games, anything greater than 5 years old is actually considered outdated. Putting non-digital games and simulations in the same class as digital ones or in the same category assumes that the medium hasn't changed, when in fact the medium has changed, and it has changed significantly. We previously examined the relationship between serious games or simulation games, games and simulations, and more specifically we saw that every serious game or every simulation game is itself a game, and every game is itself a simulation. Although Thiagarajan, as we previously saw, viewed simulation games and simulations as the same, I'm going to differentiate between the two. For our purposes here, a game must have the following: rules or constraints, an end, in other words an identifiable objective, a score, in other words a means of measuring progress, and it must have some form of conflict or challenge. A simulation, however, does not necessarily have to conform to all of these four characteristics, whereas a game, for our purposes, does. This brings us to the end of the material for video clip 2, and it brings us to our synthesis questions. So number 1, according to Catron and Becker, all simulations are biased. Explain. Number 2, according to Catron and Becker, no simulation can be truly realistic. Explain. And finally, number 3, how do you think an educational simulation or a serious game is designed? And this is the end of video.